The telegrams said training accident. They said the men died in Vietnam. Both statements were written to be false. The men had died across the border in Laos and Cambodia, in countries the United States insisted held no American soldiers on missions that did not exist, in a unit whose own name was built to mean nothing. The Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG, the most classified American ground unit of the war, and the one that paid for that secrecy with a casualty rate that passed 100%. Not a misprint, more wounds than men, because the men kept going back until the wounds outnumbered them. For 37 years, their families were not allowed to know what the telegrams had lied about. Start with the name, because the name was the first lie. Studies and Observations Group sounds like a room full of clerks producing reports nobody reads, and that was the point. Formed in 1964, SOG answered to the Pentagon and the White House, not to the generals fighting the public war. Its actual work sat on the other side of the map, reconnaissance and sabotage inside Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Along the road network, Hanoi called the Trung Son Road, and the Americans called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The trail was the war's bloodstream, and it ran through countries where officially the war was not happening. So the men sent to watch it could not officially exist either. Every man volunteered 3 times to disappear like that. Once for the Army, once for Special Forces, once for a unit that could tell him almost nothing before he signed. What it could tell him was what he would give up. On a mission, across the fence, he carried no dog tags, no letters, no American-marked weapons, nothing in his pockets that named a country. If he was killed out there, the position of the United States government was that he had never been out there at all. The missions themselves wore the same camouflage. The programs that sent teams into Laos ran under names chosen to mean nothing, Shining Brass and then Prairie Fire. The Cambodian program answered to Daniel Boone. And one mission set existed that the men considered sacred, Bright Light. The standing teams kept ready to go in after downed American pilots and missing men. Rescue operations launched into denied country for people the government could not admit were there. SOG men bled on Bright Light missions for air crews they had never met in countries neither of them was in. The working unit was the recon team. 2 or 3 Americans and 4 to 9 indigenous soldiers, most of them Montagnard tribesmen who fought beside SOG for years and died beside them in numbers nobody fully recorded. A team went in by helicopter, often flown by South Vietnamese King Bee pilots, willing to hover a machine the size of a truck in a hole in the jungle canopy. From the moment the skids left, the team was alone in a landscape the enemy owned outright. Getting in alive was a craft of its own. Insertions went in at last light, so a compromised team had darkness coming instead of a full day of being hunted. The helicopters flew false landings before and after the real one, dipping into empty clearings so watchers on the ridgelines could not tell which touch had left men behind. Teams stepped off the skids and froze in the tree line, sometimes for an hour, listening because the first minutes decided everything. Some teams tapped the trail itself, splicing recorders onto North Vietnamese field telephone lines and carrying the enemy's own voice traffic home in a rucksack. The intelligence justified the whole program on its own. Collecting it killed teams on the landing zones. And the enemy knew they were coming. Hanoi treated the trail like the strategic artery it was, and it built a dedicated system to protect it. Trail watchers on the landing zones, tracker teams with dogs, counter-reconnaissance units whose entire job was hunting the hunters. The trail's guardians grew with the war, from local watchers to entire security regiments with tracker dogs and radio nets strung along the road, until a recon team's average time on the ground before first contact could be measured in hours. SOG veterans came home describing bounties on American recon men. A team could be in contact within minutes of insertion, and when a team was found, it came down to 6 to 12 men days from help against a road system garrisoned by tens of thousands. The numbers that came out of those fights moved through the unit like folklore, and the men repeated them to each new volunteer. That in the worst years, a recon man's odds of finishing a tour unwounded were 0. That the casualty rate among recon men passed 100%. By 1968, being a SOG recon man was statistically the most dangerous job the American war had to offer, and the men who did it knew the numbers and signed anyway. One question before the story goes back across the fence. and put your answer in the comments. Every man in this unit volunteered 3 separate times, and the third signature came after they told him the odds. What do you think it takes to sign that third paper? Write it down honestly. Now, the man who signed it more often than anyone, and what the government did to his medals, his name was Robert Howard. He spent roughly 54 months at war, most of it running SOG's cross-border missions, and he was wounded 14 times, 8 of the wounds bad enough for Purple Hearts. In a span of 13 months, Howard was nominated for the Medal of Honor 3 separate times. The first 2 nominations were downgraded to lesser awards, and SOG veterans have said for decades why. The actions happened in places American soldiers were not supposed to be, and a Medal of Honor citation is a public document. You cannot publicly honor a man for a battle in a country you deny fighting in. So the paperwork shrank the medals to fit the lie. The action that finally could not be shrunk came on December 30th, 1968, on a mission launched to find a missing American across the border. The landing turned into an ambush by a superior force. An enemy charge blew Howard's weapon out of his hands and filled his hands and face with shrapnel. Unable to walk, he crawled through the fire to a wounded lieutenant, treated him, dragged him toward cover, and then spent the next hours crawling along the perimeter under continuous attack. For more than 3 hours, he kept moving along that perimeter, wounded again as he crawled, until the helicopters could fight their way in. The men who came out with him told the story for the rest of their lives, and the Army could not shrink this one because too many witnesses had watched a man with shrapnel in his hands refuse to stop being a soldier. Even then, the citation that reached the public had been sanded smooth, a public document about a battle the map still denied. He received the Medal of Honor for it, and he stayed in uniform for decades more. Ask the men of that unit, and they will tell you the medal count still runs too short. The fighting was half the cost. The silence was the other half. A SOG man who survived his tour came home to a country that was learning to despise the war, and he came home gagged. He could not say where he had been. He could not correct a single rumor. The missions were classified, the losses were classified, and the families of the dead were left holding telegrams the government knew to be false. 50 of the missing had gone down in Laos, and not one man captured there ever came home. Their cases sat in sealed files while their children grew up on the training accident story. The secrecy outlived the war by decades. The after-action reports sat in classified archives. Reunions happened quietly. Men comparing notes on missions they were still not sure they could name aloud. When the histories of the war were written in the 70s and 80s, the most dangerous ground job in Vietnam appeared in them as a footnote, or not at all. John Plaster, one of their own, finally wrote the unit's history in the 90s, built from interviews with the survivors, and the book landed among the veterans like a decompression. It was the first time most of them saw their war in print under its real names. Declassification came slowly through the 1990s, and in April of 2001, 37 years after the first teams went across the fence, the unit received the Presidential Unit Citation. The men were old by then. The document mattered anyway because it did the one thing the telegrams never had. It told the truth in the government's own name. The missions existed, the country knew, and the men had carried it alone. Old recon men stood in formation one more time to receive it. Some wept without changing expression, a thing soldiers can do. More than a few had empty places beside them that the citation named only as the unit, which was at last accurate. The unit had done it, the unit had paid for it, and the unit had kept the secret longer than any of them believed possible. A hand-painted sign hung at one of SOG's launch sites through the worst of those years, and the men who staged out of that camp read it on the way to the helicopters. You have never lived until you have almost died. For those who fight for it, life has a flavor the protected shall never know. Judge the unit by the standard it was built for. SOG's teams put American eyes on the trail for 8 years. They mapped it, wiretapped it, mined it, called airstrikes onto it, and forced Hanoi to divert tens of thousands of soldiers into guarding roads instead of fighting battles. Every one of those guards was a man who never reached the war in the South. Put the two sides of it next to each other. On one side, a few hundred Americans at a time running 8-man missions. On the other, an enemy road network forced to armor itself along hundreds of miles watchtowers and tracker teams and anti-aircraft guns strung through jungle to defend against 12 men in the grass. Generals argue to this day over what the campaign changed. The men who ran the trail never argued about what it cost. That is what the denied missions achieved, and what it took was the number this video opened with. More wounds than men. The full accounting is still not finished. Files are still being opened. Names are still being added to studies of a unit whose official position for most of its existence was that it had no names at all. What survives is exact enough. A citation dated 2001 for missions dated 1964. A soldier nominated 3 times in 13 months for medals the map would not allow. Around 50 Americans still in Laos in a war their own telegrams denied. And a bland little name, Studies and Observations Group, that turned out to be the most honest thing about the whole arrangement because it was designed to make you look away, and for 37 years, it worked. Subscribe. This channel is built for the war stories. The big documentaries walk past one verified account at a time.